Awesome. Welcome, everybody, to our episode of Coping in Color. My name is Duane Wiafe. I am a social worker, psychotherapist based out of Ontario. Happy to work in the area of mental health. And I'm really excited for this guest we have, Ralph, today. I personally think it's really important to talk about mental health and to talk about Black men's mental health. And I'm happy to welcome Ralph Bryant here, originally from New York. Ralph is a queer writer, father, survivor of sexual assault. He's lived in Canada for the past 15 years. And you were hospitalized. He was hospitalized at Joseph Bryant Hospital, where you were forced to kind of deal with untreated trauma. And since then, that process, you've written 3 books of poetry. You've traveled across the country through a process of healing and inspiring others. I'm amazed at some of the amazing work that you've done with Fortune 500 companies, with developing the NBA D League. You've done work across Canada and the US, and I'm just really excited to hear your story and to kind of hopefully shed some light on things that we can do to support people in this area. And I'd like to also highlight also your work and allow you to kind of share, the recordings and the whole process of that. So I just wanted to start by welcoming you to the podcast.
Thank you. It is a blessing to be here, and I think that there's no more important conversation that any of us can be having than the how we deal with our mental health. So this is important. Thank you.
Amazing. I wanted to ask start by asking you to share how you ended up here in Canada. Maybe it's a long story, but like, how did you end up here and that process to getting into, hospitalization?
It's so yeah. Okay. So it is a long story that I can tell shorter than the longer story. I fell in love with a Canadian woman, and but we were in a long distance relationship, and that relationship um uh led to us deciding to have children. And she uh unexpectedly got pregnant, and I am and at that point we were not, still trying to figure out what our relationship was. But I had a father who left at 2, and I saw maybe 6 or 7 times in my whole life. And the times that I saw him, those times were destructive. And I did not, and had a family, lineage that did not have fathers in their lives, and grew up in a neighborhood without fathers. And, and I did not want to be my father. And so the choice of whether or not to move here became no choice.
Mm-hmm.
And, and, and a lot of my healing work has taken me back to the place of kind of confronting
Mm-hmm.
in therapy my relationship with my father, because I think that for a lot of us, that lack of male connection
Mm-hmm.
uh, can do a lot of harm in our community. So and my the other an important part of my healing journey was wanting to uh remove the generational trauma that my family had experienced around mental health. My mother was hospitalized when she was 16, uh, and her mother struggled with their mental health as well. So there's some lineage of mental health struggle and trauma and all of that, in my story. And I wanted to tie that off so
Mm-hmm.
that my children could, move forward in a different headspace.
I think that it's amazing how important, like, that environment is in the healing journey of recognizing, a history of maybe men not being in that role of fathers. And I like the way you put it, tying that off, and you're kind of starting from the sort of the end of that knot, and having an impact. I think, what do you think, what are, up until that point, what was your relation to mental health? Did you feel like, were you accessing services, or did it take for that hospitalization to really start the process for you?
So I had, you know, my mother was hospitalized at when I was an adult. I mean, when I was a teenager, and when in that same year that she was hospitalized, I suffered through a violent sexual assault, and something happened to me in that process that and I I think that is the you know part of my mental health story, although I think there's some other things related to my family life. um I knew I was struggling for years before I ended up in the hospital. When and that came to a it came to kind of a head during the Me Too movement, where so many women were standing up for themselves and talking about sexual assault and sexual harassment, and um like a flood of repressed memories came back to me.
Mm-hmm.
And 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 so that was, I think, up till that point I had masked pretty well.
Right.
I had been able to do a lot of things. I went to university. I had great, I had a pretty cool and diverse career. I
Mm-hmm.
did all of this cool, stuff, but um, but I had been secretly in a tremendous amount of pain that I didn't share with anyone. And the in the Me Too movement, when I started to, the one thing that I had done really well is detaching my sexual assault from who I was today. And that, um, when and for me, it was also tied to it was also tied to sexuality because of that assault. So there was a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
in that mix. Um, and I think so. I think I would describe my mental health like a slow leak
Right.
that had been leaking for 30 years, and you can drive on a slow leak for a long time. But eventually, the air there's going to be no air in the tire,
Mm-hmm.
and so my hospitalization, which or the energy that led to my hospitalization, which probably started 4 or 5 months before
Mm-hmm.
that, um, it was the result of a long simmering feeling of a lack of self-worth, and just some stuff I needed to work through.
Yeah. I find this culture in just general society, but specifically among black men, of, needing to hold it together, needing to be strong. There's also these kind of social kind of assumptions of, young black men being, promiscuous and having a lot of relationships. So and then also this idea of power and strength, right? We enter into rooms, and despite who you are, there's this impression of us. I find it kind of compounds when it comes to what you're talking about. Where is the safe space for black men to be open about anything, let alone something as significant as being a sexual assault survivor? There's, like, as a young person, that combination of shame, and it often gets downplayed, right, in a lot of ways. And so I think part of what I think is so inspiring about your story, um, is how open you are, and it sounds like that openness is a part of your healing process.
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
I also think that that's what when I envision like what the Me Too movement meant. It was that piece. It was women standing up and openly saying, "This happened to me," and then
Mhm.
a few men also started, to do that. So I just wanted to say that it's so powerful. And I've worked with a lot of men where, yeah, they come in somewhere in that slow leak, and a lot of the men, it's there may be a crisis, or they're just on the verge of crisis. Can you share any reasons from your experience why you may not have accessed supports, or any things that may have gotten in the way of you reaching out for support?
So um, I had been asking for help, uh, but not in the way, but and sometimes directly. Like I tried some medications. I was, um, but I think that I didn't have, I didn't know. I knew I was struggling, but I didn't know how to put into words what I was feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I was, it's, I so I would say that, I said to my wife at the time, yeah, I'm not feeling like myself. And I went to my doctor, who I'd known for a really long time, and or since I'd been in Canada, and I was like, yeah, I'm not feeling that great. And so he tried, a bunch of, he gave me a bunch, he did what doctors do, right? He gave me a bunch of meds to try, and I restarted therapy, which I hadn't been in therapy for a number of years. Um, I'm really good at what I now know is that I'm really good at BSing myself and other people, and so therapy got me to a point, but I realized in my last, at that time, well, I realize now that I was kind of telling therapists to, I was telling them behind the mask. I was having conversations with them behind the mask that I was wearing, but not letting them into the other side. So it was making the therapist feel good because we were having some breakthroughs. It was making me feel good, but the work I was focused on was still very surface
Right.
and it wasn't until I allowed myself to go deeper, um, that I was able to or forced to go deeper in some way. But all of the things that you said, why I didn't ask for help. I was embarrassed. I but I think the biggest, I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I was scared. I was worried about losing all of the stuff that I had gained,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that was a lot of it, right? I lived in $1 million house. I had two great kids. I had a beautiful wife. I had car. I had all of the trappings
Right.
of what a successful life should look like. And I think and so for me, a lot of the times I was battling, my mind and my spirit were battling each other. And my ego was saying, you've got all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How could you be struggling with your mental health? All the things when you were 10 years old and you wanted to be out of you dreamt of getting out, you got out. You can't be in a nicer place than this.
Mm-hmm.
And 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 my inner child was saying, yeah, but
Right.
I'm struggling. So there was this thing that was happening, and it wasn't until, um I had to get really, 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 um honest with myself, uh and when I got into the hospital, when I got to the hospital, um I the first time I met with the doctors after I had kind of stabilized, I said to them, do you want to know why I'm here? And they were like, well, that'll come later,
Hmm.
which I took as a no. And I think what they were, and I know now, they're like we had some work to do before we got there. But I, when I got out, I made a vow to myself in the hospital that I didn't want to get out of the hospital and ever come back. I didn't want to be my mother,
Mm.
who bounced back and in and out of hospitals every few years, and I wanted to get to the bone of it. And I didn't want to do the therapy surface. I wanted to really understand generationally how I got here.
Mm.
Um, and I can be a pretty obsessive person. I think that's what's made me a successful like employee. Um, and so I tried to take that same level of obsession about my mental health, which led and my spirituality was kind of intertwined into that. And so I really wanted to get to the bottom of it.
Mm.
And I'm still, and that I think is a continuing journey, but that is the that's where I am.
Yeah. I I find, I again, I said I worked a lot in correctional environments, and you know the idea of corrections is very results based, right? So if someone
Yeah.
has a substance abuse problem, do a program, don't do drugs. You're involved in crime, do XYZ, and don't commit another crime. So as a health professional, the goal within that system, which is very medical model, like
Yeah.
there is an end, which is like you're cured or you're fixed, having to support men and women to move forward. And some of them I've seen are in that space of they're giving me just enough to engage, but they're not quite ready to take the mask down. And no one knows what needs to happen for that mask to come down. Even that person, like they may genuinely want to, but they don't know how to. If you've been acting like you've been fine for 30 years, you're not going to sit in front of a therapist that you just met and be like, all right, by the way, this has all been a big lie. um,
Right.
I, I'd like to know how, and it'd be nice to share how you view your recovery now. Because for a lot of people, it might be okay if you have, bipolar disorder, you have the highs and lows. Maybe you get on medication, and the medication keeps you balanced, and you never experience any of that again. And that is recovery, which we know that I know, and a lot of people are starting to learn that that's not exactly it. So I'd like to know how you would describe your recovery today.
Yeah. So I have there were a couple of agreements that I made with myself at some point. Um, I hated the medical the pharmaceutical this right. I couldn't work. Like I couldn't I just didn't feel anything like it, and and then I had a couple of really bad um, allergic reactions to allergic, both that ended me up in the hospital. So so that was one, and I wanted to understand the feelings more than put wallpaper over them, because I'm good at putting wallpaper over them, but I wanted to truly understand why I'm what is happening to me when I'm depressed, and what is happening to me when I'm not depressed, and how do I need to self-regulate in order in any stage that I'm in. um and and that's where I am today. So I you know I have I like I've learned a lot about how my mind works and what it needs when it needs to be propped up, and when it needs to be soothed. An example of that is, after this I will probably be uninterested in talking to another human for several hours, because I understand what it takes for me to be like here,
Yeah.
right? And that's not necessarily where I want to, where that's not where I am. That's not my resting mental rate, right? Um, and that's cool. And I know and I will know at the end of this what I need to do to regulate that. I know what I needed to do to be in a space to be able to have this conversation.
Hmm.
And that's just recognizing that some days you feel like a nut, some days you don't, right? Some days you feel great and you can take on the world, and some days you feel like you just want to stay in bed. And so I wanted to understand all those facets, right? Like what does Ralph need at every stage of that game, so that, and how do I so that I understand that for myself. That was kind of level 1 level, but the greater level is being able to then express that to other people,
Right.
right? So you know, I went out to dinner with for a friend's birthday yesterday with a friend of mine, and I was like, tomorrow I'm just going to need to chill,
Yeah.
right? So it's a way of, kind of creating, boundaries is the outward expression. And I don't think that was something, I don't think, I know that was something that I was not good at, because I didn't think I was worthy of putting myself first. So recognizing what uh and when you, and it also starts to normalize my energy, right? So it's not that I'm struggling with my mental health. You know what, the spectrum is that, um it then doesn't define the fact that I had a mental health struggle, doesn't define who I am. It's just, part of who I am, as I'm black, and as a father, and all of those things. So it changes the way
Hmm.
that I think about think about who I am.
Yeah, I love the discussion about like regulating and self-regulating and that knowledge when you know what you need. And I think that's one thing that we take away from people as sometimes as health professionals, assuming that we are the holders of knowledge. So you're coming to me and I'm gonna use CBT or whatever, and you're gonna be better, but not allowing it to be kind of an even exchange of knowledge where I'm learning from you and you already have managed this up until now. And I may have a few things that can offer to help. And I think that shifting to being a part of that process is a really important thing. I know we're almost at the point for questions. Hopefully I can get to two more questions, but one, I wanted to ask if you can share at all. Um, okay, when I think of spirituality in my experience, I've seen it as both a risk factor for someone's mental health to maybe deteriorate or to add
Mm-hmm.
pressure, and a protective factor. And I know that in your work, spirituality has played a role, and I would just love to hear what your experience was with that both then and now, and if there's been any change or shift for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I said earlier that I was really good at BSing therapists, and when um, and therapy is expensive. And so the combination of not having, uh, a few years ago, being sorry, let me take a step back. So when I ended up in the hospital, um, and I was kind of, first couple of days, the first day on the main ward, I've been in triage for a few days. A woman um, came up and gave me a hug and whispered in my ear, "God is greater than your storm." And I had been a lapsed Christian since my sexual assault. but had spent a lot, time. I spent 3 months in an ashram in India. I considered joining I went to the Million Man March and considered joining the Nation of Islam. I was, hang, thought about it. Grew up in New York, so I almost joined the Nation of Gods and Earths, and 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 so while I would not have called myself necessarily a spiritual person during that time, spirit uh, has been part of my existence, and I know in my heart that someone who has been through what I have been through wouldn't be here without the blessing of angels. Um, I could think of 100 ways that I could be dead, and many black men that grew up where I grew up are, or in prison, or so for me, I think that, and so when she whispered that, God is greater than your storm, in my ear, it 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 linked my mental health journey and my spiritual journey, and what I accepted at that point, that was that, and when I was in the hospital, so a lot of time just to think, is that, and in a conversation that I thought I was having with myself, God whispered to me, "You can't be you. Basically, you can BS the therapist, but you can't BS me."
Yeah.
And so, God and I started talking, and talking, not in not in a structured way. I believe that organized religion is the root of many of our evils. So it's not about church, or having it. And I don't believe that your spirituality needs a gatekeeper. That our spiritual story is as unique as a fingerprint, and you need to find what works for you. And I think, and often in many cases, it's a bunch of different things.
Hmm.
uh, and so it is, my spirituality today is my anchor. It is, the center of my whole existence, and that, like, and that is an ongoing thing, right? I want to redefine the relationship that I have with spirituality, and that people have with spirituality, because I think it's been hijacked in a way, um, that that and it's been connected to, politics and policy, and in a way that I think is harmful,
Hmm.
and doesn't allow people, like, pushes people away from their spirit, because, uh we're seeing the way that religion has bastardized what's the most important thing, which is our direct connection to the divine. Um, so it is super duper important to me, and I wouldn't be here without it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I find in my experience, like, I've seen that where the organized religion or these structures or the need to have a gatekeeper creates so many more pressures that sometimes lead to more difficulty. And as people
Sure.
find a balance there, I personally, both in my own experience and seeing folks are able to recover. I really appreciate your how much you've shared. This is just such helpful insight, and just how open you are. It's really inspiring. We're going to take a quick break, 1 minute or so break, and we will check in with some questions from folks who are participating. And I know I had a few more, so we'll do that now. Thank you so
Okay. Excellent.
Coping in color.
Um, so we're gonna go into some questions. We'll take a sec to see what questions folks have. I had one that I was curious about because I think it's important to consider. Um, sorry, can oh, are you able to see me? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. I wanted to know what you find um, the challenge would have been, if any, also as a member of the LGBT community. Like when I did a talk in a prison focused around black men's mental health, and it was very inspiring, and it was beautiful to hear so many men be honest about their experience, and in that space I could feel the positive energy for them seeing a person of color who's a therapist, who I disclose, my experiences of anxiety, having a mother who dealt with mental health issues, had been hospitalized, and just what that was like. And then at the end, when it was kind of everyone asked questions, and when folks were leaving, someone kind of pulled me aside and was like, hey, I'm a gay man, and I wonder what supports are there for me. And just the fact that there was in that space of empowerment and support, there was this small him one, and who knows how many other people who still didn't feel
Sure.
safe enough to disclose and talk about, I have mental health issues and there's this part. And I'm wondering if
Yeah.
you can talk a bit about how that has impacted or what your experience has been that way.
Yeah. That's a really great question. So I the same. So the age 13 was one hell of a year because the same year that I was just before I was sexually assaulted, um, is when I started to was the same year that I started to question my sexuality, and I was, and and so there was a lot of confusion in that time, and I think that was that, and I know that that was a big part of my, kind of internal struggle, and I we there are ways we have this conversation, for most of the public that are, straight, and there are ways we have this conversation, and you can find resources for folks that are are gay, and then, because I am bisexual, I just there was just didn't seem like an on ramp for me to have that, you know that conversation, and I didn't understand it myself, right? So, and uh, so working through that was, again, connecting to all of the things that you were saying earlier about how do we as black men show up, what does this mean about, my manhood, as if those things are, you know our sexuality does not define our gender, right? And I just didn't, um and I think also part of why I was able to BS therapist well, because I never talked to any therapist or any humans that I knew about the fact that I was, interested, or had homoerotic feelings towards men. Never talked to any about that. And certainly none of my relationships with women, or my marriages, and that had always been a part of who I was my whole life.
Hmm.
And so I, yeah, I think any time you add another layer, right? So, if you're just a regular, it's weird to say this, but if you're a regular white man, right? You've got no, nothing kind of restricting you. So then you're a white woman. Okay, now you've got the patriarchy laying on you. If you're a black man, you've got, what we're dealing with. If you're a black woman, you've got that. And if you're gay, it's like the more is stacked against you, and the more you've got to unpack. Um, and we have to find a way in our community to remove all of the gatekeepers, right? Like that, those are all gatekeepers that are stopping us and preventing people from going in and seeking help and support. Um, and so we have to first normalize the conversation that it's okay, normalize the practice of seeking help. But then we have to recognize that we are not one thing. None of us are one thing. And so how you unfortunately, this job falls on you and to figure out how you work through the intersectionality and how you create the space for people to be their whole selves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of the reason why, not part of the reason, and I not think, the reason why I am here having this conversation with you is I heard a phrase a couple of years ago called heal loudly. A good friend of mine um, runs an organization. It was the first time I heard it. I know it's been around before. And that really resonated with me, and I think is why I'm here, because so many people suffer in silence
Yeah.
and suffer in darkness, and so we have, those of us that are fortunate enough to that have done the work to get to the other side, we owe it to our the people who are suffering in silence to shine a little light, and the way we shine light is by telling our stories. And I recognize that not everyone has, not everyone has the ability to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for me, it was literally a conversation at Lake Superior Provincial Park, where I had been when I was driving across the country. When in a meditation, I heard clearly that this was what I was supposed to do. And so I'm just doing what I've been called to do so that I don't get in trouble. uh, uh, but I think it's also incredibly important for people to be able to see mental health in real time, right? We often see it at the end,
Mm-hmm.
when harm has happened, and we don't see it at the beginning, but we rarely see it in the middle, where you're just slogging through it. And I think understanding and being able to recognize the continuum, and that's what this my On the Verge project is about, is that um uh is I didn't realize in the time in real time that I was documenting a mental health journey.
Right.
I was just, got really obsessed with recording myself, and one of the just before I ended up in the hospital, I found a recording which I had not heard until I was we were we were chronicling the pieces for this On the Verge project, that I had recorded an audio that I for my sister and my closest friend at the time, saying that I've been called to do this thing, and it's going to take 5 years to do it, and it's going to change something. They thought I was just insane.
Delusional, right?
Yeah. And so here we are 5 years later talking about it. You
Hmm.
know,
Yeah.
who knows?
It, it reminds me of Marsha Linehan, who is like sort of the founder of DBT. And after this was created to deal with personality disorders, years later, she comes out and shares that as a youth, she was hospitalized. She would tell therapists that she's going to create a program to help with this kind of issue, and it was delusions of grandeur. And then years later, we have a whole modality from someone who was doing what you were doing through their experience, found a way to kind of get past it and then share that. with other people. She's a psychiatrist and well known around the world. I have two questions from the chat, and I'm going to ask them in
Okay.
opposite order because I think it'd be fitting just looking at our time. Um, when you look at the therapist that you worked with, was there a particular type of therapist that you found helpful? For example, age, race, whether it was a male, female. Was there anything that really stood out in terms of a particular type of therapist?
Um, I I would say there were two therapists that I can remember that were um, didn't allow that just saw that I was over processing, like that I was I was telegraphing my answers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was when this is dry snitching, but I got arrested stealing a car when I was 15, 16. And I had to, in lieu of going to Spofford, which was the youth correctional facility, I went into this diversion program, and there was this black uh, probably my age today, black man there that named Arthur. And shout out to Arthur because he was just amazing. He did his therapy um, over a ping pong table, and anytime that I said something that sounded like where I wasn't being true, he would just smash the ball.
Hmm.
And it was so jarring that um, I just didn't, and I never got good at ping pong, and so I just didn't want the ball smashed at me anymore. So, um, so I thought that that was really clever, and that was a long time ago, and that has stuck with me. Um, and then I, I at the beginning of Talkspace, I had a therapist who's Talkspace, which was a black woman, and there was something about the detachment uh, from from conversation, because I think the ability for me to reflect. I'm not as good. I'm not as good. I was never a good freestyle rapper.
Okay.
I just I over process, and it just takes me a while to say what I really mean to say versus the answer I'm giving you just to get out. And so I think that reflection was that reflection time. I got a lot out of that.
Right.
So um, and in a lot of ways, I am I've been thinking a lot about an interest in getting back into therapy, because I think or because I think there are, again, I want to codify where I am, right? I want to make sure that the assumptions I've made are real and anchored in both my kind of where I'd like to play spiritually, but how I function in this world that we're in. That I'm still working on that.
It sounds like that actually leads well into our next question. Um, Two things, just because I want to give you both so you know we've probably got about another 9 minutes. One was, what would you say is your current status with your mental health? Um,
Hmm.
Sounds like from hearing what you're talking about, it's more looking at it linear, like as a journey. And love for you to talk on that. But I also want to make sure that we have enough time for you to really share what On the Verge is, as well as how people can access it. So just so you know, time frame. Yeah, if you could
Okay.
do that.
I would say that I am in active recovery, or active healing, right? And I think that, I am, um, I know what I was like before, and I'm not there. And I know, and I can see, uh, a version of, and I see the version of myself that will be, that I'll, codify all of this work that I've done. Like, I can see it. Many days I can be it. And the work that I think I still want to do is just to be able to, uh, just tighten up the screws around how I take care of myself and seek help when I am, when I have depressive episodes. Um, and so part of why and this may not necessarily be a therapist, is to be able, it might be a life coach, it might be a some, it is for some tools and resources to make sure that the assumptions I've made about myself and where I am are accurate.
That's That's amazing. I think it's so important for people to understand that it's a process. And sometimes when I'm working with people, I equate it to some of my own. Like I was a basketball player. I tore my ACL, got osteoarthritis, and I deal with pain every day. And I have periods of time when I can't walk and I'm in bed, and I have periods of time when I'm doing great and I can go play ball and I'm pain free and I'm
Right.
moving. And it's an ongoing process. And as you said earlier, I know what I need to do to practice self care to both prevent, let's say outbreaks or breakouts of injury, as well as to heal if I overdo it. And I think that
Right.
we need to start considering that in terms of mental health, but also the bigger piece, it's sounding like from what you've said, make the client a part of the process. Like, I can learn from what you've already been doing, and maybe I have a few things that I can offer, as opposed to, assuming that I'm the gatekeeper of your wellness, which is just not it's kind of that medical idea, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd love to hear about On the Verge, if you can share what it is, what the whatever you want to share about it, as well as like letting people know how to access this.
So it is a work in progress. But what On the Verge it will be a docu series that, um, looks at the intersectionality between mental health and spirituality, because, as I said, mine are kind of, they're impossible to separate for me. When I was at, uh, my lowest point, and could not access resources, I started recording, myself, and in some ways I thought it would be this like found footage kind of thing, that someone would find these recordings and it would make sense to why I wasn't here anymore, because I was hearing these voices that I was about to die. And um, and and I continued to record myself, both, kind of as I've been along this journey. And what I realize now is that recording I sent to my sister, that was like, this is going to be important. I now know is On the Verge. So it is. Uh, it it takes, viewers along, and inside, a mental health recovery story, from, from hospitalization to healing. And these 5 years have been a pretty wild ride for me. And so it includes, getting out of the hospital and driving across the country, and meeting with shaman and spiritualists, and spending a lot of time with no clothes on in the forest. Um, uh, and during that during that drive across the country is when I was I have had during that time a series of extraordinary spiritual um, interactions and with and letting me know that this is that the whole my whole journey is for something greater, and that I think that greater is we is especially true for Black men. We are at we are most at risk. We report the least. We don't access services, and our suicide rates are high. And so I am, I talked about doing this, for my kids, but I think there are so many of us that don't. Um, that suffer and don't understand at all stages of the process, and so On the Verge is a way to shine a light uh into the journey, not kind of I'm good now, let me tell you how good I am. It's like, you're gonna hear me in the hospital, uh crying, because that's what it was when I recorded, and I you know I think that there's I hope and I sorry, and I hope that what will come out of that, and the goal what will come out of it, is a series of tools and that will we will be able to have folks like yourself as a compendium to the project to say, this is what this looks like,
Mhm.
or this is what this was in that moment. How do we, support uh, people in that moment? Like, being able to like take a microscope in after you know and I think for me, I feel very strongly that that's a part of why um it feels like a life's work. It feels like this is why I was put on this earth, is to create On the Verge, and I feel humbled to do it.
Last piece. One is I wanted to know where or how people can access this work, but also if we can just end with any advice you would pass on to someone who maybe is in that space of just starting to realize there's some difficulty and they're struggling and maybe they haven't quite accessed services. Those two things, if as we wrap up, please.
Uh, there's a website being built, which is On the Verge, ontheverge.com. It's not quite ready, so if people want to learn more, they can find me on Instagram at Ralph underscore Bryant. Um, I and then I want to say something quickly, both to the person who is struggling, but more importantly, to the community of people around that person. Because most people who are struggling has a community of people who aren't hearing the signs from that person.
Mm-hmm.
And so for the person who is struggling, um, I would say get a notebook. And I feel like part of my journey was that I had to write it before I could speak it, and I had to speak it before I could, you know, heal it, right? Or ask. I had to be able to speak it before I could ask for help. So start wherever you are. Start, and if you hopefully that is with a human, and if that human is either directly connected to you and you trust them, great. And if it has to be an external person, find that external person, but you're worth finding the help. Um, most That's the most important thing. No matter where you are worthy of finding that help. And to the people around that person, If you know someone that is struggling, even if you question it, if you knew they had a sniffle, you would reach out to them and offer them some soup or some tissues. If you know someone, if you even suspect someone is struggling at any stage, check in with them, and show them love, because our mental health challenges are a community challenge. It's a people challenge, and not the only way we're going to be able to do it is if we tackle it together.
Thank you so much for the time, and I look forward to watching this great body of work. And I really found it inspiring for myself, as did our audience. So thank you so much, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Duane, and thank you to the audience. And I appreciate this conversation. Thanks.
All right, take care.